Asymmetric games are tough ones for designers. On one side, it can potentially create a great experience for players while immediately grabbing the attention of devoted players of this kind of games. But also, asymmetric games are tremendously difficult to design and balance, since the designer is not only balancing two or more completely different systems, but also a shared system that needs to be balanced to work in conjunction with the other two. Asymmetric games can be defined in many ways, but in my opinion, the most important distinction is based on where the asymmetric elements are placed in the system of the game. Asymmetry is mainly used in two different parts of the game, in the means that players can use to achieve the goals, or on the goals themselves. Also, it is important to differentiate between an asymmetric and an unbalanced game. For example, football is a symmetric and unbalanced game, since each player is unique and has more or few abilities than others, but each one has the same rules to play the game and share the same objective. Dead by Daylight is an asymmetric game since one's player has a totally different objective and ways to achieve it. So the game is unbalanced if the game is based on different players' skills or if the rules of the game places a player in a better position to start or throughout the game. By contrast, asymmetry is achieved by creating completely different objectives or way to play for some players. And hey, sorry to interrupt, this is Gabriel Chauri, welcome to Game Design Thinking. As always, you can find a one-page summary of the information on this video in the description below. Let's continue analyzing asymmetric games. The beauty of asymmetric games is that they allow players to engage in different ways to play the same game, so players can have a relatively different experience if they choose to play with another faction, which will be the main word I will use throughout the video, but bear in mind that faction can mean characters, teams, and many other types of asymmetric agents. To exemplify how asymmetry can generate a different experience, we can take the board game Root by Leather Games. Like many war games, this game has different factions, each with its own abilities and special powers, but they have to achieve the same objective, so in this case, asymmetry comes from the means to achieve the goal. What sets this game apart from similar ones is that each faction is played completely different, meaning that if a player engages in a specific playstyle while playing with one faction, it can't be automatically transferred to another one. They are just too different for the knowledge to be copied one-to-one. This means that the game offers many options for players to manipulate the systems of the game and have many unique experiences. Also, players can choose to specialize on one faction or even against another faction, which can further add depth to the game experience. But these options also add complexity to the game. Despite all the cuteness of its characters, Root is a difficult game to learn. Now, with all the good things that asymmetric games bring to the table, there are also downsides. First, asymmetric games are harder to design and balance than symmetric games. It is far more complex than only adding a new faction to your game. If you think about the difference between the factions in a game like Starcraft, those aren't as impactful as in Root. Yes, each faction has different ways to build and other nuances, but most of the game revolves around the same loop of increasing the number of units and destroying the enemy base. In Root, even as the objective is getting 30 victory points for all players, the means available to obtain these points vary tremendously. One faction has multiple soldiers and earns points at the end of the turn by placing buildings, while another consists of just one soldier that earns points mainly by helping other players by giving them cards in exchange for items. This is not to say that Starcraft isn't an asymmetric game, but Root is a game with more asymmetry than Starcraft. And second, this also has an impact on how pleasant it is to play the game. To play asymmetric games, players need to understand not only their faction, but also all the other, in order to create a strategy considering the advantages and disadvantages of their enemies. As a game designer, you have to teach players to play with one faction, while also teaching them how the others one work. It makes for a deep experience, but also one that needs a lot of time and dedication from players themselves. Games that aren't necessarily strategic can get away easily with this. For example, games like Among Us, Dead by Daylight or Hello Neighbor don't necessarily need a huge investment of time to understand the rules. Now, if you want to design an asymmetric game, there are some points that you need to consider before jumping into the difficult world of designing them. First, consider where are you going to place the asymmetry. Creating asymmetric objectives is easier to design, but it will require a lot of balancing to ensure that all objectives share a relatively similar difficulty level. Creating asymmetry in the mechanics is far more difficult, and the more asymmetric the different factions are, the more you are engaging in creating different systems, basically different mini-games inside a shared system, a common base game for every player. You have to focus on creating a strong base system that can support adding systems on top of it. For example, the base system of Starcraft is a simple war RTS in which units can kill or be killed with varying degrees of health and damage, while also adding a rock-paper-scissors system between enemy units. For Root, the base system is a simple tabletop wargame which consists mainly of units as points and grid movement, with dice as the mean to define combat outcomes. The complexity comes from the mini-systems, the factions on top of these systems. Along with this, define what level of asymmetry you want to achieve. Starcraft and Root are both asymmetric games, but the impact of asymmetry is more profound in Root because each faction is profoundly different from the others, and also because there are more factions than in Starcraft. And finally, inspire yourself in the real world. We are constantly presented with asymmetric situations, in which one faction has an objective while others have a different one. Think for example about teachers and students. Both want a knowledge transfer, but their relationship, their ways to achieve it, and sometimes their goals are asymmetric. Or think of two different animals catching a fish. A seagull will fly to get its prey, while a bear will use its paws to get it. Totally different ways, but the same objective. The world is full of asymmetries, not only imbalances. Catching these asymmetries can be a starting point for a new asymmetric design. Thanks for watching the whole video. As always, you can find a one-page summary of the information on this video in the description below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell. And remember that better games can create a better world. Farewell, fellow game designer.